Oh, good morning, everyone. I heard that school started back up this week for you guys. And, as I reflect upon the pandemic and all of these things, I cannot imagine what life would be like going through school in the context of the pandemic and with social distancing and all of that. And, I feel that this past year has been a series of impossible situations for all of us, no matter where we are in life. And we know that the best years are still ahead of us because Jesus Christ is coming back and, we will be glorified with him on the last day. But with the events that are going on right now and with the events that happened this past week, I have this ominous feeling inside of me that tells me that there will be worse years ahead of us as well. A simple fact is that regardless of how this year turns out, we all face problems of every kind every single day, whether they are small problems or big problems. But sometimes there are things that come about in our lives that seem like they're impossible to fix. We have a country that's divided right now, and it seems like nobody wants to cooperate, and it seems like this country is impossible to fix on an individual level between you and your friends, or on a national scale as well as a global scale. Well, I personally have a story that I want to share with you guys in which I went through an impossible situation in my own life. There was a time that I was in Arizona for missions, doing VBS, leading the VBS with the Navajos. Right from the beginning, it was a series of unfortunate events. Our trailer broke down within the first hour, and it took us a good 4.5 hours to 5 hours to fix. And then after we had fixed it, we were on our way, and 30 minutes later, guess what? The trailer broke down again. We had to sleep near a city called Barstow in California at a Denny's parking lot. And from the first day of missions, when we actually got there was miscommunication everywhere. And people were there doing their own thing without communicating, and it was just absolute chaos. Anyhow, during those 10 days of missions, I made the single biggest leadership mistake of my life. We were at a park doing VBS, and it started raining unexpectedly. So without consulting the leaders, I decided on my own to take the VBS indoors. And unfortunately, this park was quite a big park, and some of the parents that came late decided to leave their children there without signing them in. And the rain was very light, so it wasn't like pouring or anything, it was just drizzling. But the kids sat out in the rain, completely neglected until sundown. When the parents went back to the park to pick up their kids, they saw their children sitting out in the rain, completely neglected and abandoned. And this was all due to the mistake that I made as the leader leading VBS. And some of the parents decided to call us in the middle of the night and said something along the lines of, "Is this where you drop off unwanted kids?" And some other things along those lines. And some people even went as far as threatening to sue us. Anyways, I was shocked and I could not believe the extent of my mistake. I lost all hope in my confidence as a leader. But the pastor called me to the side and encouraged me one-on-one, and many of my leaders also came to encourage me. Though there were shortcomings from myself and many of the other leaders, by the end of the missions, the kids' lives were changed, and the troublemaker kids were on the front row, and they were the ones that were dancing to the VBS songs and answering all the questions about the Bible. Whenever I look at this particular miracle that Jesus performed, I wonder what Philip felt when Jesus asked him, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" We are already on the fourth sign, and we have crossed over the halfway point of the signs and the I am sayings. Anyhow, there are more mini-series on the series on Jesus that are still in development right now. Anyhow, let's get into the context first. The first 4 verses give us the context of our passage. Verses 1 to 4 tells us that this event happened in Galilee close to the Jewish Passover festival. And it tells us that Jesus was performing miracles to heal sick people. Then Jesus withdrew to the mountains with his disciples. If we see the other Gospels, and the same story gives us more detail, and it gives us a fuller context of this whole passage if we do an additive storytelling. Mark 6 tells us the reason why Jesus withdrew was because his disciples had just finished and returned from a mission trip. While they were gone, Matthew 11 and verse 2 of today's passage tells us that Jesus was busy doing his own ministry as well, healing the sick and all of that. And Jesus knew that his disciples needed rest and needed a debriefing. Also, we know that John the Baptist had just been executed and he wanted to withdraw from people according to Matthew chapter 14. All these things gave a reason to why Jesus wanted and needed to withdraw. Then a great number of people gathered around Jesus. And if we look at the same account in Mark chapter 6 verse 34, it tells us that the crowd was like a sheep without a shepherd. In the other Gospels, it tells us that the crowd was with Jesus for quite some time, almost a whole day in fact. Now, have you ever gone a whole day without any food? It's completely exhausting, and the crowd and the disciples had not eaten all day. And I assume that as I will be if I had not eaten all day, that they will also have been hangry. And I'm sure that we all know that when you are hungry and angry, even nice things like a text from a friend can seem extremely annoying at the point of hangriness. Then Jesus went to Philip, who was probably hangry himself as well, and he asked him in verse 5, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And it also tells us that Jesus asked Philip in order to test him. It says that Jesus already knew what was going to happen, but Philip did not understand. I personally don't think that any of us would understand either. This was an impossible situation that the disciples found themselves in. And Jesus threw this question out to test Philip, but also his disciples as well. His concern, in many ways, was the people that were hungry, but on the other hand, it was also about his disciples. And in today's passage, there are 2 types of responses that the disciples had. First was Philip, and you can clearly read the frustrating tone that Philip gives here in verse 7. It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Philip must have found Jesus' question absolutely absurd. If something like this happened to me when I was hangry, unpleasant words would make their way up to the tip of my tongue, and I would have to try extra hard in order to keep those words to myself. So the first response is Philip, and it is the "we cannot do" type. For this type of person, anything that doesn't follow their idea on how things should work, including what God commands, will doubt and question. And there are doubts and questions that come across all of our minds from time to time. But this is not one of those. this is not the case for Philip specifically, but this is applying it to our lives. This is one of those people that tackle everything and anything in word, action, attitude, if it doesn't make sense to them. And though there are cases like Philip, where he was genuinely asking a question, there are people that are this type of a person that asks questions just to be rebellious or divisive. The second type of people are the ones like Andrew. Verse 9 tells us that Andrew said, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" This is the yes, we can do something type of person. A Christmas season has just passed a couple of weeks ago, and many of you know the carol, Little Drummer Boy. And this carol describes this second type of person extremely well. In this carol, there's a poor boy who goes to baby Jesus and meets Mary and Jesus. But unlike the Magi, he has no gift. He's got no gold, he's got no frankincense, he's got no myrrh, he's got nothing to give Jesus, but he has a drum. So he decides that after Mary spent hours putting him to sleep, what Mary and Jesus needs is a drum solo. So he plays the drums for them because that's all he can do. And this is the exact attitude that Andrew had. He is saying, I don't know how effective this will be, but hey, here's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And when we are faced with impossible situation where God is testing us, what will our response be? And will we be like Philip and question the logic of what's going on? Or will we take actions of faith? In the Friday night Bible study, Faith, Hope, and Love, we refer to faith as described in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. It says, confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And this is exactly the sort of faith of people like Andrew. Andrew did not know what the 2 fish and the 5 loaves of bread would do, but he had the right understanding of Jesus as the Son of God, and he brought to Jesus all that they had. I talked about the missions in Arizona briefly at the beginning of the sermon. Man, you cannot imagine how many things went wrong and how many things that I missed out. From 10-year-old students starting fist fights and kids hitting and bullying the youngest member of our missionary team and filming it and uploading it onto social media. It was just an absolute mess. But that did not matter. What mattered was that we gave all we had despite their disrespectful attitudes and offensive behavior. But at the end of the mission trip, all the students that were fighting, all the students that were disrespecting us, they even started throwing stuff at some of our youngest members. All those students were the ones that were dancing to the worship songs, and they were the loudest voices in worship. But it wasn't us that did anything. It was God. All we had to do is give it all we had and do the task that God had given us for that day. And we prayed for the kids, of course, and we expected for the best. We were hoping for what we do not see, and we were expecting what we cannot predict. Andrew brought to Jesus 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's all they had. And that is what Andrew gave him. But God makes beautiful things out of what little we have. It's not a matter of how much we have, but it's a question of giving it our best. And if our best is 5 loaves and 2 fish, God will take that. So how will you respond when God is testing you, giving you tasks to do? What will you do when you are faced with these types of impossible situations in life? I am sure that even if we are tempted to act like Philip, now that we know that God requires us to have faith like Andrew, I am sure that God will also grant us the strength to act like Andrew. And when Andrew brought forth what we had, Jesus worked a miracle. Verse 11 tells us, Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And not only that, verse 13 tells us that they gathered all the leftovers, and there were 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. When we bring God what we can, no matter how big or how small, God will multiply it and use it for His glory and for His kingdom. Last week, we talked about the fact that Jesus was the gate and how Jesus said, I am the gate, and that we have to go through Jesus and filter everything that we face in life through Jesus. We also need to filter our problems through the eyes of Jesus and see them for what they are. As you know, we are on a series called A Series on Jesus. So let's have a look at the character of Jesus in our story. Who is this Jesus? What is Jesus' nature? Verse 14 tells us, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Who is Jesus to me? Who is Jesus to you? Who is He to all of us? What do these signs and wonders reveal about Jesus? We said at the beginning of the series on Jesus that signs and wonders were supposed to reveal the nature of Jesus, specifically that Jesus is the Son of God. So Jesus being the Son of God, what does this have anything to do with us? Another question we must ask has to do with us, and it is, the fact that we are called to be disciples of Christ. But as disciples, what is our responsibility? And what authority do we have as disciples of Christ? As disciples, we must remember that the laws of the way we think, how logic should work, is not relevant to God. What is relevant is that when God tests us, He simply asks us, who are His disciples, to give it our best shot and give it all we can. But one thing to remember is that if we are indeed going through a difficult times when we cannot make it on our own, we need to look to Jesus and not our problems. If we see the response of Philip, he looked at the problem at hand and he said that in order to solve this problem, they would need a half a year's wages to solve the problem, and not to solve the problem completely, but for each one to have a bite. But if we look at Andrew and see the way he reacted, he brought 5 fish to Jesus and 2 loaves. His focus was not on the problem. His focus was on Jesus. He brought everything that he had to Jesus. And yes, when we are faced with problems, we should ask God to help us through the storm, because God desires conversations with us. But the important fact is, when we are having this conversation with God, we need to keep our focus on Jesus and Him alone. We need to remind ourselves who we are following. We are following Jesus, the Son of God, and we are following God. And this is a responsibility that we have as disciples, the responsibility to focus on Jesus. while we need to present what we are going through to God, and we need to express ourselves to God honestly because that's what God wants, the authority that we have as disciples is that we can declare to the storm how big our God is. So while you're expressing yourself to God and presenting your problems before Him, present them for what they are. We need not declare how big our storm is to God. We need to declare how big our God is to the storms that we are facing. To conclude, we all go through difficult situations in life, and sometimes they are small, and other times they are impossible to fix. Sometimes they are personal in our lives, and sometimes they are corporate or within the community that you're living in. And sometimes, like we have seen this past week, it's on a national level. And other times, as with the pandemic, it's on a global scale. And God takes us through these situations sometimes to test us. And we can respond to those situations in two ways. We can either have the I cannot do attitude that Philip had, or we can have I don't know what or how to do, but I will do what I can do attitude. We don't need to think of things we cannot do. We need to bring to God what we can in each of our lives. And if the best we can do is 2 fish and 5 loaves, that is perfectly acceptable to God. Because the focus should not be on our problems. The focus should not be on what's the quantity of things that I can bring. The focus should be on Jesus, and Jesus can multiply the best you can give. Even if that's a little bit, God will multiply that. And the focus should be on Jesus and only Jesus. So no matter what you are currently going through or whatever you may go through in your future, Jesus is the one that takes us through it. So let's face our lives with boldness and humble confidence and declare to the storm about our God's greatness.